Thank you for that lovely introduction. So, Anne, why did you write this book?
Before I answer that, thank you all so much for coming on this humid and stuffy night. It's really great to see so many people in such a full bookstore, and I really appreciate every single one of you being here, so thank you. The book, actually the inspiration for the book was friends of mine, some of whom I've known for many years, Russians, Iranians, Venezuelans, people who had spent years and years and years fighting to change their countries. And in some cases, you have to say they were doing everything right. They were able to organize, in Venezuela, demonstrations of 1 million people on the streets. In Russia, create a network of clubs and discussion clubs and debating societies. In Iran, a massive women's movement that almost took over the country just very recently, and a couple of years ago, and yet they weren't winning. They weren't able to change their countries. And one of the analysis, one of the conclusions that they came to, and the thesis of this book comes from them, is that increasingly leaders of autocratic states, not all of them, but of a particular group of states, now they help one another stay in power. They see one another as allies. Although it's not, I should say, they're not a bloc, they're not an alliance, they're not an axis. They're a network, and they have come to share surveillance technology, tactics of repression. They've come to work together on the global stage. They share diplomacy. Increasingly, they share military technology and goals. They don't have the same ideology. They don't, communist China and nationalist Russia and theocratic Iran have very different political systems. But they do have a set of common enemies, and their enemies are my friends, the democracy activists, and their other set of enemies is us. And by us, I mean me and Peter and pretty much everyone here. Their enemies are the values that we talk about, the language that we use, words like transparency, like rule of law, democracy, but not only that. These are people who stay in power thanks to their connections to one another, thanks to their use of surveillance, thanks to the technology of repression that they deploy, and they are threatened by people who want to know more about how they earn their money, by people who want rights, by people who want freedoms, and so that group of dictators has learned to fight back against that. And so the book is really a kind of wake-up call. I think probably it's safe to say that most people in this room don't wake up in the morning and think about what's going on in Moscow or Beijing or Tehran or Caracas. But there are people who wake up every morning in Beijing and Moscow and Tehran and Caracas who think about us. And part of the way these regimes have developed is they began to understand, my guess is about 10 years ago, that fighting against the democracy activists and the people who wanted change in their own countries was going to require a kind of war of ideas, and they were going to have to undermine the ideal and ideas of democracy. They were going to have to eliminate the attraction of democracy for their own people, and that meant they needed to eliminate it where it's most powerful, and that means here in Europe and elsewhere in the democratic world. And so the book is a description of how how they came to be, how they came to have power, how that power operates, and then there's some ideas at the end about what we can do about it. That's the overall thesis of the book.
Before we get into how they do things and where they came from, you used the word threat there, and you talked about how they felt threatened by their own people. Are they a threat to us?
Yes. and I want to be careful because there are a lot of people now who kick around this expression, the new Cold War, or Cold War 2.0, and I don't think that's what we're engaged in. I'm not sure that this is so much of a military conflict, or it could become that, and I suppose the war in Ukraine is the first piece of this conflict that's become violent. But there is a war of ideas, there's a war of tactics, there is a narrative war. They have I'm sure we'll get into this soon, they have a set of ideas that they want us to adopt, or they want to, they're interested in disrupting our political conversations. They're interested in what we say to one another. And because we now live in a world where there's a single global conversation, where anybody can enter into our conversations on social media and join them, that's now possible in a way that it wasn't before. And they're also interested in being able to use our financial system to keep their money, and these are very, very wealthy people, and they're interested in using their money to buy friends in our societies. And so for those reasons, the way we need to think about them is how we strengthen our own resilience and how we change our own societies to make them work better so that they aren't susceptible to influence and bribery and so on. That's what I would say. Okay, so let's try to, so we are talking about a new set of adversaries. So let's try to understand them a bit more by understanding how they emerged. So you just said it's not a new Cold War, and obviously your amazing history books are largely about the Cold War. How are they different? And you watched. Not only did you write about the Cold War, you witnessed firsthand as a journalist, Western victory, or the victory of democracy over authoritarianism. Where did these guys come from? I thought authoritarianism had been defeated with, the arc of history and the bow of values and whatever it is. Yes, so poor Frank Fukuyama, who invented the idea of the end of history, I saw him on a stage in Washington, actually, last week, and somebody started to ask him something about the end of the history, and he said, I can answer that question, but I just want you to know I've been answering it twice a week for the last 30 years, and I'm not going to say anything new tonight, so it's so maybe I'll leave him alone. But yes, I spent 1989 in Warsaw. I was then a young freelance journalist, and I watched the end of communism, and I drove with a friend of mine to Berlin in the middle of the night after the wall fell, and that's the person I married, so it was a fun trip. I remember the enormous enthusiasm of that moment, and the expansiveness of the years that followed, not only in our country and not only in Europe, but also in the post-communist world, where people were really genuinely excited about change and believed that it was possible. And one of the sources of optimism at that moment was the idea that our ideas, meaning we the Western world, not just we Americans, and actually I try now to avoid the word Western because I think we can include Asian democracies and other democracies as well. So we in the democratic world, that our ideas were so powerful that they were going to somehow move automatically, as people used to say, from west to east. That there was and that the way this was going to happen was through engagement and trade, that we would invest in China, or we would invest in Russia, or we'd invest in Kazakhstan. We would invite people to come and study in our countries, and the integration of all these worlds would inevitably produce peace and prosperity. And also eventually, sometimes it was not so clear, sometimes it just meant we'll all live happily together, and sometimes the idea really was that this kind of integration would inevitably lead to democracy, that the states that had been dictatorships would transform themselves. And there was a certain amount, it's true, of it was convenient to think that for a lot of people, because the benefits of trade with China were so enormous and people made money out of it. So there was a reason why it was, feeling like you were both making money and doing something good. That's kind of, that cheers people up a lot. But what we didn't notice along the way was that what we were also doing, and I have to be careful because, again, there were Russians and there were people in China also who hoped for the same outcome, but we were also empowering people who were making money, sometimes using loopholes in our financial system, making money, making a lot of money, sometimes stealing a lot of money, taking it out of the country, laundering it again through our financial system, bringing it back, and then using that money to gain power. And the most famous example of this, which I talk about in the book, is the career of Vladimir Putin, which you know also very well. I mean, Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. He was a former KGB officer.
This is 90...
This is in the early 90s, early 90s, 91, 92.
He wore very ugly suits.
He wore bad suits. He had a bad haircut.
Yeah. He was kind of pasty looking as well. It's a bit like Bezos has changed, so has Putin, but that's the end of any kind of comparison.
Although Putin doesn't seem to have a new wife, so that's different. Yeah.
Divorced his old one.
Yes, she lives in. I heard she was living in Paris, but maybe that's not true. Anyway,
in a nunnery, I heard. Anyway.
So how did and I try to dissect this a little bit in the book. So how did Putin become so powerful? Well, he as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and there are more details, and you know I've borrowed the stories reported by a lot of great journalists. Essentially, he was part of a group of people who stole a lot of money. They stole money from the city of St. Petersburg. As I said, they took it out of the country. They laundered it through financial institutions. Very often worked with Western partners, Germans, people from Liechtenstein. They had Western bankers. There was a company that Putin was linked to that was floated on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and they used this, and they essentially used Western institutions to build up their own wealth and their own power, and then they began to use that wealth and power to gain political power inside Russia. That's a one-sentence version of the story. There's a more elaborate version as well. And we meaning we in Europe and the United States turned a blind eye while this was going on, and a whole series of accountants and lawyers and, as I said, partners essentially enabled this rise to power. And there's a slightly different story in China, but what we didn't notice was that by trading with autocracies, sometimes you create openness and integration, but you can also empower people who are not interested in the rule of law, who are interested in using the money that they earn to stay in power, and that was and we helped create these new kinds of autocracies. And you asked about the difference between the 20th century and the 21st century, and actually there are several differences, but one of the main differences is money. Stalin was not very rich, he had everything he needed, but he wasn't interested in money. Putin is a billionaire. Xi is a billionaire. And, either they are, or people around them are, or their families are. And these are very wealthy people whose wealth has been gained through international trade, through globalization, and who then, once they gained it, never wanted to lose it or give it up. And Peter and I were having a conversation with a Ukrainian friend of ours a few days ago, who was talking about how, to some degree, kleptocracy precedes repression. In other words, once you have people who've stolen a lot of money or gained it, or gained it in dubious ways, they're the people who are least interested in transparency and in the rule of law because they need to keep it. And so very often the root of dictatorship is kleptocracy.
So if in the Cold War one has an opposition of two systems, here communism versus capitalism, here a lot of elements of the systems become merged, the financial market piece of it, but they sort of get corrupted or hacked in a sense, yeah? I wonder, did the rising autocrats immediately see a kind of, were they immediately out to sort of hack and corrupt the system and then to use it for foreign policy leverage as well? Or did that just emerge as they became very rich and they needed to stay in power? Or were they always like, okay, well now we're going to sort of like buy our way into the system?
I don't want to overgeneralize. I mean, I think there have been changes. I mean, there's a very interesting in this light is the story of Gazprom, this is a company that was the Soviet Ministry of Gas, and it was privatized. And now it has a very strange status. It's a company that is both a private company, and so people earn money from it, and it has shareholders who become wealthy from its activities, but it's also an arm of the Russian state. So Gazprom also does foreign policy. It invests in ways that are useful to the Russian president or to the regime. I was in Germany. This is now going back many years, but Gazprom once happened to pick a soccer team in Germany that it would sponsor, and it happened to be a soccer team that was the favorite team of the person who was then the German foreign minister and is now the German president. And I remember him telling this to me. He's like, "Oh, it's just so interesting that Gazprom sponsored my local team." I said, "Yeah, it's very interesting." I wonder why, Gazprom would sponsor exhibitions of Russian and German history at the at German museums. They were very interested in creating a relationship between Russia and Germany that had nothing to do specifically with the gas trade, although the gas trade was also a piece of that story too. So what you have developing in Russia, and there are versions of it in other countries, is companies that are both, they look like private companies, and they can have out to the outer eye, they look like they're structured like private companies, but they act like arms of the state. And Gazprom, for example, is essentially co-owned by people who work for Putin. I mean, that's how it works. It's as if the president of the United States was also the chairman of the board of Exxon, and he used Exxon's investments were designed to help his political career. And somebody's going to say, well, that's exactly like something that has just happened. But it's not, we haven't had quite that closeness yet. I mean, and when you see this development across different countries, you see that you can then see that they, when the Russian government or the Chinese government is interested in helping another dictator, they don't necessarily have to do it through government-to-government means. They also use their companies. So,
well, that's the worry about TikTok. A Chinese-affiliated social media company, and all this alarm that it's not just a company, because companies always have this dual use in these systems.
And they think of it that way. So we don't think of it that way. I mean, maybe we should, but we don't, and they do. They think their companies are arms of foreign policies.
So a weird reversal kind of happening, yeah? That which is meant to be the great victory of democratic capitalism becomes kind of the seeds of the emergence of a new type of kind of kleptocratic autocrats. But what you're saying is that they start working together to keep one another in power. Can you give me some examples of that? When is the moment they start collaborating?
So the person who explained this to me the best is a friend of mine was the former mayor of Caracas, who was a Venezuelan dissident, who said, people talk a lot about, the Americans helping the opposition here and, the role that outsiders play. There is what Americans do in Venezuela, whatever help they give to independent newspapers or small groups, is a drop in the bucket compared to what the other autocracies have done to help keep an extraordinarily unpopular and incompetent regime in power. So, Maduro, who's now the president of Venezuela, he actually has an election on Sunday, who has, together with Hugo Chavez, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in South America. It was an established democracy. Within a couple of decades, they turned it around. It's now the poorest country in South America. It produces more refugees than Ukraine. Many of them turn up on our southern border. How did this happen? Well, and I should say Maduro is very unpopular. He will lose the election on Sunday if the votes are counted fairly. Why is he able to stay in power? Well, he's able to stay in power because the Russians give him weapons, because the Chinese invest in Venezuelan companies, and often companies that are close to members of the regime, thereby enriching members of the regime. That's how investment is used. Because the Cubans offer surveillance technology and help with policing. They have police advisors. Because the Iranians, and this is a really interesting one, if you think about Iran and Venezuela, I mean, these are countries on different parts of the planet. They have nothing to do with one another historically or geographically. But Iran has a deep involvement in Venezuela because they're both under sanctions. And the Iranians help the Venezuelans evade sanctions. They help them with technology and with selling oil. And in turn, the Venezuelans help the Iranians, allegedly giving visas to Hezbollah operatives so that they can travel in Europe and so on. So it's almost as if there's a team of autocrats who circled Venezuela and helped the regime, seeking sometimes to make money out of Venezuela. It has a lot of natural resources, and at the same time help to keep Maduro in power. You could tell a similar story about Belarus, which is a very weak country, also very unpopular leader. Why did he stay in power? He stayed in power because literally at a moment when he lost an election, the Russians brought their own policemen in to replace his police, who became disloyal, their own journalists to replace Belarusian journalists who became disloyal. Eventually, once again, you have a series of Chinese investments in Belarus now. You have a Chinese business park there. You have, the same characters show up over and over again. The Cubans support them at the UN and so on. I mean, it's as if when they see one another falling, they rush in to help and they make money out of it. But they also, there's a sense that, if one of the club were to fall, were to lose to a democracy activism, that makes all of us look bad. And of course, as you know, the most dramatic example of that was the revolution in Ukraine in 2014, which Putin took one look at. I mean, this was, if you remember, this was a street revolution. It was an anti-corruption revolution. There were young people on the street carrying signs against corruption, in favor of the rule of law, in favor of the European Union, joining the rest of Europe, Western institutions. And Putin saw that and said, "That's exactly what I don't want ever to happen in Russia." And that was really the beginning of the Ukraine war.
So Woodrow Wilson had this famous phrase, to make the world safe for democracy. So essentially they are making the world safe for autocracy.
Yes, or make the world safe for corrupt Russian money.
I was going to say, so I'm trying to sort of parse out, if it's not about ideology, obviously it's always about suppressing rights to a certain extent, but some of these systems are more open than others. But the theme seems to be kleptocracy. Kleptocracy as in like groups of people who see the point of being in power as a way to amass wealth. Not something on the side that you do, but that's the point of it, and then to keep it. So that seems to be what they have in common, and then the sort of web of murky financial possibilities through shell companies and non-transparent financial vehicles and Western lawyers who make it all possible. But the other thing you look at in your work, apart from the money, is the lies and how they're coming together as a propaganda force. And again, a bit of a paradox, because it was meant to be free speech and the sort of the battle against censorship that made that made democratic powers victorious in the Cold War. What's happening now?
Well, you wrote a book called "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible."
I did,
which was about exactly this. So, I'm hoping you'll chime in and help with the explanation. I mean, so what we thought would happen after the Cold War was that there would be free press and there would be a battle of ideas, and the best ideas would win. And instead, that didn't happen. And instead, we now live in a world where ideas are powered by propaganda campaigns, and the ideas sometimes win that are the angriest and most divisive and most overwhelming, and those are the ones that people see the most, that travel the easiest and fastest on, according to the social media algorithms. And so we're not really in a world where there's a rational conversation and people come to modest and measured conclusions. In the autocratic world, What fascinated me was, for a long time, one thought of Russian propaganda or Chinese propaganda. We thought of these being very separate, but in very recent years, they've also come together. So there's been an enormous Chinese investment in newspapers, in broadcasting, in content sharing arrangements all over the world. Very obviously in Africa, but in Latin America, in Asia. They put a lot of money into doing and having arrangements with other papers, with other countries. There's an expression in Chinese that means borrowing boats to reach the sea, and that means that they prefer their ideas to appear in a local language under the byline of a local journalist. So they're also.
Can you say that again?
Borrowing boats to reach the sea.
I also love the Chinese phrase for their kind of propaganda, thought and tongue work.
That's good too. And the other good, in the book I talk about a famous Chinese document which talks about what the Chinese see as the greatest threats to their political system, and the name of the document is document number 9. and then it lists the 7 perils to the Chinese Communist Party. Number 1 is Western constitutional democracy, and freedom of the press is on there somewhere, and civil society or civic engagement is on there as well. So they see these things as threat. But to fight back against those things, they created this enormous network of newspapers and magazines and friendly journalists and so on. And that was their system, and for many years they just promoted the ideas that it was good to do trade with China and so on. More recently, they have begun to also kind of partake in a broader authoritarian narrative that you can now hear from Russia, you can hear from China, but you can also hear it from political parties and politicians in this country and in Europe. And this is a broader argument about autocracy being safe and stable, and democracy being divisive and dangerous. And autocracy and dictatorships protect traditional society and stable and a kind of vision of old-fashioned stability, and democracies promote degeneracy, and by that they sometimes mean sexual degeneracy, and therefore you need to be wary of them. And so they're not merely promoting their trade interests or their particular, but there's a broad narrative, and then many other pieces of the story are many news stories are interpreted through that lens as well. So.
But that sounds like a lot of stuff that I hear since I've moved to America. How do these forces interact with what's going on here?
So it's always a mistake to think, well, poor, weak Americans are somehow influenced by, mean foreigners or mean Russians. It doesn't work like that. In essence, they created these narratives, and they create these stories, and they create these conspiracy theories, and then Americans, or some Americans, find them useful. And mimic them, use them, borrow them, use them in their own, in their own writing, in their own.
Could you be names, please?
Okay, I'll tell you the story. So there was one story that I followed quite carefully, and this was the story of the biolabs in Ukraine. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but at the very beginning of the war, there was a story, a kind of conspiracy theory emerged that the United States had bioweapons, was building dangerous biological weapons in Ukraine. Okay, this was not true. Ukraine has laboratories and it has scientific agreements with the US, just like every other country on the planet, but nobody was building biological weapons in Ukraine, and this was debunked multiple times, including by the UN and the UN Security Council.
Just very quickly, just so you get the level of madness. These were biological weapons that were going to be specifically designed to attack ethnic Russians.
That's right. And also they were going to be carried by birds. That was one version of it.
Which is actually, yeah. Okay. And mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes.
Anyway.
It
wasn't even a serious conspiracy theory.
It wasn't a serious conspiracy theory.
This was a very silly one.
Nevertheless, it was started by Russian diplomats who said it in public. It then went out on the Chinese state network. So the Chinese repeated it. They repeated it on their, in their media. You saw it used in sort of Chinese-influenced African media. It turned up in, and then the Venezuelans used it in their media. I started tracing the story, like who had used it and where. I found it in Venezuela. I found it in African newspapers. I found it all over the world. And I also found it in the United States. And there were a couple of people who there was one tweet in particular, a kind of long Twitter thread about the Ukrainian biolabs that had millions of views in the United States. And then, of course, Tucker Carlson, here you wanted a name, went on, he still then had his Fox News program, went on Fox News and demanded that the United States explain its biological weapons program in Ukraine. So you had, and why did he do that? He didn't do that because he was forced to. Nobody was making him say that. I doubt very much he was paid to do it. But for his purposes, his narrative, for the arguments that he wants to make about America and American foreign policy, it was useful. So what was the purpose of this narrative? It was to weaken the arguments about Ukraine. It was to make the U.S. effort look, what was the Ukrainian war? It's a colonial war of imperialism. It's a war of occupation. And the idea was to make it look murkier and muddier and maybe to make Joe Biden look more sinister. There was using that narrative contributed to a more general argument that, what the U.S. does is create chaos and disaster, and what autocratic states do is bring stability and calm and peace. And so that was just an example of how this one fake story was repeated all over the world. It was pushed by this network of autocrats who were doing it for different reasons, and then picked up and used and spread also by people in the United States. And there are numerous stories and numerous versions of that you can follow. Many connected to the Ukraine war.
And we'll get on to the moment, what should we do about this? And I think I might let the audience ask that question. I know you've had you're going to have to be answering it twice a week for the next 5 years, so you might as well get into it.
Just like poor Fukuyama,
You said at the start, I want to go back to this question, what is the threat of this? Because we've been observing this for a long time, and it's clearly been about regime survival, it's about money, making the world safe for autocracy. But since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I sort of returned to the people who've been telling me for a long time that this is just phase one, especially for the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, who are the three main protagonists. Phase one is hacking the system, corrupting it, softening it up psychologically. Phase two is kinetic, it's physical. The Russians are making lots and lots of plans, not just to invade Ukraine, but many other places in Eastern Europe. The Chinese have, well-known plans for military expansion. Are we sure they're not just going back to something, preparing the way for something much harder and also much more physically threatening?
So my guess is that they would like to win these conflicts through propaganda and bribery, and they would prefer to do that rather than having to fight the war. But you are right that they are preparing to fight in a way that I think we would not have anticipated in 1989. And so we then come to the Russian war in Ukraine, which we've seen how it works. So Putin very quickly began to run short of equipment. Where does he get his support? He has drones from Iran. He has ammunition from North Korea. He has the Chinese are selling components that help him rebuild his defense industry. U.S. sanctions and European sanctions together haven't. When we first laid them out, we didn't take into consideration the existence of this counter network that was able to continue supplying the Russians with components and so on. So yes, we now see that there's a. I mean, if not a direct plan to start a war, they're certainly willing to help Russia prosecute this war. And even though we don't all necessarily see it that way, they see the war as very vital. They would like Russia not to lose, because losing would be a blow to their political systems and to the way that, and it would make them, the friends and associates of Russia look weaker. So they're very interested in winning the war.
Yeah, I mean, the more I sort of look at the amount of military production happening in these countries, then I sort of feel that this isn't just going to be about money and information.
No. Although, as I said, if they can win, if they can achieve what they want through money and information, they will. I'm sure the Chinese would prefer not to invade Taiwan. I have a section on this in the book. What they would rather do is weaken Taiwan internally, persuade the Taiwanese that they should give up, convince some Taiwanese that they really should be part of China, convince us not to support Taiwan. I mean, there's a whole series of things happening that they would like to win it more easily.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask my next questions about what should we do, because I'm pretty sure that as I open it up to this vast audience, that'll come up. Okay, how many of you would like to ask questions? Let's get a sense of this. Okay, so this our event is all about democracy. But we need to learn about authoritarians. So I'm going to act like an authoritarian. And I'm not going to let everybody speak. I'm going to gather bundles of questions and give you the flexibility to answer the ones you feel really confident about. That's how it works here. So why don't we take 3 or 4 and then gather them, because we just won't have time. We only have 15 minutes. So
Peter, I'll come around with the mic. We'll ask. Yeah. You're saying 3 to 4.
Let's move from the west to the east in a true metaphor for what's been happening.
Right, so that the ideas move from the west to the east.
Exactly. Okay, we'll go from front to back.
So my question has to do with Turkey and Hungary, and how, as members of NATO, they're able to do and get away with what they do.
Yeah.
And one comment, I thought the German sports team was very interesting, because that's exactly, it seems to me, in my uneducated athletic world, what Saudi Arabia has done with that golf tournament.
Which golf tournament? I don't follow golf.
The LIV.
I don't actually consider it a sport.
The LIV, or whatever.
Yeah, they now sponsor the main golf tournament. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So. Or do you want to take some more questions?
Well, should we take a few? I just don't think we'll have...
All right, okay.
We will, of course, try to get to every question. But maybe... Usually I find they come in themes anyway.
Yes, my question was regarding what you mentioned about how in China, Russia, and Iran, the authoritarian leaders have managed use the power to make themselves into billionaires. Do you see the reverse of this happening in the U.S.? Certain billionaires, such as Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, and others, using their own money in order to gain authoritarian power, and they're promoting anti-democratic ideology and supporting candidates who are anti-democratic.
Yeah, the 45 million a month question.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for taking the question. This actually has to do with the Polish people. I'm very impressed and supportive of everything they do, and they have been doing it for such a long time, helping Ukraine, and pretty much everyone can follow why that would be. My question to you is, how do you feel that it's affecting the day-to-day lives of Polish people?
Okay, let's take a couple more.
I don't remember them all.
I do.
You do?
It's my job. It's my job. Or, Alex.
Okay.
Yeah.
As you were talking, I thought, boy, I've seen some of this in local governments. So that would be an interesting little thing to talk about. And also...
What do you mean you've seen some of this in local government? No, as in like corruption, you mean, rather than Chinese
autocracy
and
okay. Yeah.
I thought you meant Chinese influence or something.
And then also, I'm thinking about the intersection of Christian nationalism and all of this autocracy too.
Okay. Let's take one more, because I had a pattern, now you've broken the pattern. But that's okay, yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on what George Kennan would say today.
Okay. To what?
To the world we're living in.
Oh, okay, George Kennan. Okay. Okay, so I think there is a bundle here about sort of like Hungary, Turkey, and you know, these sort of autocratic tendencies here, these kind of countries right, which are part of the democratic club, or people who are part of democracies but who seem to be doing what you're talking about here.
Yeah, so a lot of the book is about the real autocracies, and I do think there's a specific group of them who who work together in this network and who do see the democratic world as enemies. But there are other countries who play a kind of swing state role, who are sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other, some of whose leaders who are purely transactional and look for, who's going to pay me the most money, who's going to invest the most, who's going to give me the most support. Will it be Russia and China, or will it be the United States? And you can see how they could go either way. I mean, there's a specific story about Hungary, which is a country which is actually the subject of my previous book, which was a country that, was a democracy and then a legitimately elected leader took over the state, changed the constitution, altered the way the country works in order to stay in power indefinitely. And that's one of the reasons why he has a lot of admirers around the world. This is Viktor Orban. And so for somebody like Viktor Orban, he shares with Putin a desire to push back against liberal ideas, and I just mean small L liberal. I mean the ideas of about
an independent judiciary.
An independent judiciary, because he does very well without one, and he doesn't really want to hear from his partners in NATO or in the European Union that he should have one, and so so for him that's in his interest the way it's in Putin's. There's a similar story to be told about Erdogan as well, and Hungary has Orban has deliberately made himself a kind of figure who can go either way. He's encouraged, for example, large and very opaque Russian and Chinese investments into Hungary. So there's a Russian nuclear power plant project in Hungary whose all of the documents about the plant and its financing are secret. And is that being used to fund the ruling party? We don't really know. We don't really know how it functions. So he sees those states as a source of funding and support. As some of his alliances with the rest of the world begin to fray. I mean, why is Hungary still in NATO? That's an interesting question. My understanding is that it's mostly because it's felt to be a bad precedent to kick them out at the moment, but I can imagine that changing.
But one of the things I really like in your book is that you obviously you have these main protagonists who are these autocratic superpowers, but you talk about autocratic practices, so kleptocracy, various types of lack of transparency, certain use of media, and surveillance technology, which we didn't touch on, which is a big part of the book as well. And I think that gets to the other question you were raising. I mean, some of the billionaires you're talking about seem to lean towards autocratic practices. Yeah. So it doesn't mean America's about to become an autocracy, but we're seeing, I think, the sort of deepening of autocratic practices here, and that's one of the things I really like in your book.
Exactly. So the book is not and maybe this is a better way of explaining why this isn't a Cold War. There isn't a geographic dividing line. There isn't a Berlin Wall, and good guys on one side and bad guys on the other. I'm describing a set of practices and behaviors and tactics that you can find in our country and you can find in Russia. I mean, and then it's just a question of proportion. And yes, I do think you're right. I think there are certainly politicians in this country, and we can discuss what their names are if you want, but and there are certainly business people in this country who would also like to be able to operate without regulation, without the rule of law, without petty members of Congress getting in their way. They would also like to have that kind of pure and absolute power. And in that sense, yes, those are autocratic instincts, and they will often use autocratic narratives to support what they do. We are here to create. We are here to create stability and security, and we're fighting American carnage and the disaster and chaos of the Biden regime. That kind of language is, and when people and again, subject of my last book, when people feel that they're at a moment of chaos and disaster and everything's going wrong, then they will often turn towards autocratic people and language and ideas. And so when you hear people doing that, saying our country is a catastrophe, we need to destroy everything and start again, what you're hearing is people saying, vote, bring in an autocrat. And that's, of course, the same kind of language that Putin uses in Russia, that you can hear a version of it in almost every autocracy on the planet, because they want to show that we are protecting our people against the chaos of democracy.
Oh, there's going to be a podcast about that, I hear.
Yeah, Peter and I are making a podcast.
Let's get some more questions in. And I haven't forgotten about Kenan or Poland. I'm just thinking about how I include them in other blocks of questions. So we're going to have to do one big sweep. Alex has got the mic.
Anne, how optimistic are you with regard to the future of democracy in Poland?
Okay, there's another Poland question. Good, we've got 2 Poland questions.
And secondly, is there any kind of viable resistance movement in Russia today?
What's your specialty?
Within the U.S. civic society, what is our greatest weakness to protect ourselves against this, and conversely, what's our greatest strength?
Good. I'm going to pair that with Kenan. These are coming together nicely.
I think it goes with Poland.
Yeah?
Yeah, how did we save democracy in Poland?
Okay. Look, I'm moderating this time, all right?
You're in charge, sorry.
This will be a little bit different. I was reading one of your transition foreign case study, June 2014.
Oh, wow.
Revolutionary Tactics, Insights in Police and Justice Reform in Georgia.
Hey, that was the first paper we did.
That was yours, and you were part of it, too.
This is a paper we wrote together 10 years ago.
And 10 years ago, okay, and I'm thinking 10 years ago, the next month after it was published, July of 2014, I moved to Tbilisi, lived there for 2 years. Wow. And it was interesting because there were people that were excited about the Georgian dream kind of thing, younger people, but yet, as we were there we could tell there were people that there were no jobs, and they didn't have health care, and they wanted to go back to Russia being in control of things there. And I know in the book, in the paper, you're optimistic about Ukraine and certainly Serbia. What do you? And I know that with the war, many Ukrainians and Russians went to Georgia to try to be safe there. What do you think's the future of Georgia? The corruption is just.
Okay, I'll think about how to move that in. You're right, you did. As soon as I see a pattern, somebody ruins it. But a very good question. Thank you for reading that paper, and I'd love to know more about your time there. Let's get the rest of the questions in. I know we're in the dying moments of our time. Well, we'll get them all together, and I'll try to make them to one.
It's certainly my impression that most of the people of this country, unlike the people in this room, are relatively clueless that there's actually a risk of dictatorship and what that actually means. And I want to know what you think of the best way to, in a sense, wake those people up, because to a great degree, I think we may only have 4 months to do that.
So that connects to that question. How you can sleepwalk into authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And that connects to Poland. Okay.
I think that one of the threats that we have is that a lot of people who are making decisions are economically illiterate. And so, we apply escalating sanctions that hurt the people we're trying to help. And then we apply tariffs who screw up arrangements with our allies. It seems that when we're trying to project strength, we're actually exhibiting stupidity.
Strength and stupidity. That could be a great title for a book.
I think it's more like a rock band. Let's answer them. We're at 8 o'clock.
Yeah. So to answer your question about a local political example, Scott Perry, just saying. But my question is kind of two-part. I wondered if you could comment about the use of social media algorithms, programming bots by foreign entities to deliberately hit our vulnerabilities and our divides and increase polarity. And the other question is, there's such a strong, like, well-financed, well-organized right-wing ecosystem that's cranking out a lot of narratives, and people that have, like, taken a word like fascism and caused it to lose its meaning entirely. And so I just wonder why those folks who are interested in the counter-narrative don't seem to be very good at it and don't seem to get that messaging out in a way that would really impact people and wake people up in the next 4 months.
So my new book is all about that. If you want to, it'll be available afterwards. But I think we have to round up now. The questions? No?
Yeah.
No? Alex?
One more?
Alex is in charge.
One more.
I've
One more.
already forgotten all of it.
No, it's okay. I remember how to... I have a plan.
Peter's book is called How to Win an Information War.
There you go.
Yeah.
As we look at the autocratic methods and maybe reflecting whether in the West and here in the West, how much do we see them used by all sides of the party, because the autocratic methods, social media or otherwise, do work and they do generate passion? How much do you see that happening across the Western world?
Okay, I'm going to try to summarize them this way to try to force to concentrate them. One of the questions I think is about, tied to the Kennan question. What do we do about this? So somebody asked about George Kennan, who came up in the Cold War, the idea of containment. You know, we're going to contain these powers. But here we're talking about practices. So how do we contain these practices, whether it's, in the struggle for democracies in Georgia or at the local level here, whether it's pushing back against narratives. So Kennan came away with almost like a geographical thing. You've got to stop them almost physically. That won't work in a networked world. So how do we push back against these practices? How do we contain these practices?
So some of it is about reforming ourselves. If you're talking about reforming the financial system, we can begin here, or we can begin with other democracies as well. We can begin with the British. I mean, London is one of the world international centers of money laundering. We can begin by closing the loopholes in our system. We can eliminate anonymous companies. Why does anybody need to own property anonymously or store money secretly? We can eliminate the aspects of the opaqueness from our system as well. So look and understanding that kleptocracy is a national security issue and not just a boring thing that is a problem for bankers. I mean, I think that's the beginning of it. And I talk in the book about how to think about that. I mean, there's a longer, deeper conversation to be had. Probably we're not going to have it tonight, about how you would or could regulate social media or create alternatives to the existing social media. Actually, Peter and I wrote a piece about that in The Atlantic, published, 3 years ago. And it's funny, at the time that we published it, I felt more optimistic. There were so many people who were thinking about how this could be done. And by regulation, by the way, I don't mean there would be a minister of information who would take stuff down off the internet. I mean thinking about how to make algorithms more transparent, how to create and use algorithms that are designed not to divide people and make them angry, but how to bring people together and create consensus. And there is, I know it sounds fantastical, but it's been done. We talked, and I've now met a couple of times, the digital minister of Taiwan, who's a woman called Audrey Tang, who has thought extensively about this, and it's a country that's constantly subject to information war, and so they think about it a lot. So beginning to think about what the alternatives could be, and then it's funny, that conversation went almost nowhere. I think it's a combination of politicians not being technical enough to understand it, the enormous pressure and influence of the social media companies, which are now some of the richest companies on the planet, and that's especially true in this country. In Europe, it's more easy to talk about regulation because they're more remote and they're seen as foreign. And also because there's been an enormous pushback from a part of the conservative movement against even any conversation about this subject. So once you use the word regulation, people start screaming censorship. We know very well academics who've worked on studying disinformation, literally writing papers about what it is and how it works, who've been subpoenaed by congressional committees, subject to lawsuits, people trying to stop them from even trying to understand how these systems, or how, for example, election disinformation works. So there's been a kind of, even before it happened, there was a backlash to the very idea. So, but it's something to keep in mind, that it's not impossible, and it could be done, and especially could be done in conjunction with other countries. I mean, I also think that because the autocratic world thinks it in terms of networks, I would like both our government, but also further, much further down through society, I'd like us to think about networks too. Who are our allies? Who should we be, who in the world who in our communities should we be friends with, but also who in the world should be friends with? Somebody asked about the Polish election. So Poland had, from between 2015 and last October, a ruling party that was very similar. In fact, they were directly imitating Orban's ruling party. So they were legitimately elected, then they tried to change the judiciary, they tried to undermine the media. One by one, they were chipping away at institutions once they had power. They eventually lost. They did lose an election. Why did they lose? They lost both because there was a coalition that was created, a center-left, center, and center-right parties jointly were able to overcome their very large differences and form a government without them, and win an election and then form a government. By the way, something very similar happened in France a few weeks ago, where a group, ranging from the very extreme far left through the Greens and the Liberals and all the way to the center right, were able to make decisions jointly in a very short space of time in order to beat the far right. And again, it required a range of people working together who didn't necessarily like each other in the past. So that's a part of the solution. But I also think there's a foreign policy version of this too. Who are our allies around particular issues, around the social media issue? Is there a group who we could pull together around the kleptocracy and so on? And shouldn't we work not only with governments, but with the democracy movements in Russia, in Hong Kong, in Iran? I mean, there is nobody who understands how kleptocracy works better than the Russian opposition. They study it, they live in it, they can talk about it, they can explain it. We should listen to them. That's one of my arguments as well.
And that was so elegant. You started at one point and then you managed to sweep into Poland and take in so many other regions. I think the only sort of issue we didn't quite answer was about the hopes for Russian opposition, and maybe a little bit about Georgia. I'll try to do that in one sentence. I don't think there's any hope for the Russian opposition because they're not in Russia anymore. They've all left or they've been killed. The Russian opposition, change in Russia will come through Ukrainian victory over Russia, and that's not abstract. That means very concrete things like, breaking off all transport links to Crimea, which will be such a humiliation for Putin. He'll have to move backwards, which is perfectly doable.
Russia's a country that when you see moments of profound political change in Russia, they almost always follow a military loss, whether it's World War I or Crimean War or
it can be less dramatic.
1905.
The loss in the Japanese War, so then there'll be change in Russia. Yeah, maybe not that dramatic change, but a change in Russia that'll have a huge knock-on effect, because these networks and these smaller countries like Georgia or Serbia, we will find shifting very fast. So all depends on Ukrainian victory, and that all depends on us and you and what happens in November. So that is how much power you all have.
So that. Yeah. So thank you very much. I appreciate everybody who came and everybody who bought a book, and I'm happy to personalize some copies. And maybe we can keep talking afterwards. Thank you.